Across the galaxy, there exists a universal truth that every species learns before they reach the stars. Some creatures are born to kill, and others are born to die. The Vorthak Empire had spent 3 centuries proving this truth with their apex predators, bioengineered nightmares that could tear through entire planetary defenses like tissue paper. But the Vorthak had never encountered a species that looked at a snarling, 8-foot-tall killing machine and thought, I wonder if I can make friends with it. They had never met humans. More specifically, they had never met Dr. Sarah Chun, a xenobiologist who carried a battered old photo in her pocket, a picture of her grandfather with his arms around something the size of Small Bear, both of them grinning like they'd just shared the world's best joke. The creature in the photo was a honey badger. And when the Vorthak unleashed their ultimate weapon on the human colony of New Adelaide, expecting another swift victory in their galactic conquest, they made one crucial mistake. They assumed that apex predator meant the same thing to humans as it did to the rest of the galaxy. They were about to learn that humans don't just survive alongside Earth's most fearless creature. They adopt them, study them, love them, and most importantly, they learn from them. The Vorthak thought they were bringing fear. Instead, they were about to meet something far more dangerous. Human curiosity, armed with nature's most perfectly engineered weapon. A creature that simply refuses to back down. This is the story of the day the galaxy's most feared empire learned that sometimes the smallest package contains the biggest surprise. Dr. Sarah Chun pressed her face against the reinforced transparent steel window of transport ship Endeavour, watching the blue-green marble of New Adelaide grow larger with each passing minute. After 18 months in cryosleep, her body felt like it belonged to someone else, but her mind was sharp and focused on the mission ahead. The Colonial Development Authority had specifically requested her expertise in xenobiology, though they had been frustratingly vague about the details. Beautiful world, isn't it? Captain Martinez joined her at the observation deck, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. Hard to believe it's on the edge of contested space. Sarah nodded, though something about his tone made her stomach tighten. The briefing materials mentioned some territorial disputes with neighboring systems. Nothing too serious, I hope. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, his reflection in the window showing a man who had seen too much of the galaxy's darker corners. The Vorthak Empire has been expanding aggressively for the past 2 years. They've taken 17 systems so far, always the same pattern. They demand surrender, demonstrate their power with something they call an apex predator, and most worlds capitulate immediately. Most worlds, the few that don't surrender outright, get overrun within hours. Their apex predators are unlike anything we've encountered before. Bioengineered killing machines, each one capable of single-handedly destroying entire military installations. He turned to face her directly. That's why you're here, Dr. Chen. If they come to New Adelaide, we need to understand what we're up against. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her jacket pocket, where she kept the worn photograph of her grandfather and Badger, his old honey badger companion from the conservation facility back on Earth. Her grandfather had always said that understanding a creature was the first step to either befriending it or defeating it. Sometimes, he had added with a grin, those two things were the same. What do we know about their biology? She asked. Not much. The few survivors from attacked worlds describe them differently each time. Some say they're reptilian, others insist they're more like insects. The only consistent details are their size, roughly 8 feet tall, and their apparent invulnerability to conventional weapons. The ship shuddered slightly as they entered New Adelaide's atmosphere. Through the window, Sarah could see the sprawling metropolis of Port Darwin growing larger, its gleaming towers and organized district a testament to human engineering and determination. Somewhere down there, 50,000 colonists were going about their daily lives, unaware that their world might soon become another casualty in the Vorthak Empire's expansion. The landing was smooth, and Sarah felt the familiar mix of excitement and nervousness that came with starting a new assignment. She gathered her personal effects, including the carefully climate-controlled biocontainer that held her most important piece of equipment, and made her way to the disembarkation bay. Colonial Governor Rebecca Walsh was waiting for her at the spaceport, a tall woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her handshake was firm, businesslike. "Dr. Chun, thank you for coming. I know the CDA didn't give you much detail, but the situation has developed rapidly since we sent the request." She gestured toward a waiting transport vehicle. "I'll brief you on the way to the research facility." As they traveled through the city streets, Sarah was struck by the normalcy of it all. Children played in parks while their parents worked in shops and offices. Street vendors sold exotic fruits that had adapted beautifully to New Adelaide's soil and climate. It was hard to imagine that this peaceful scene might soon be shattered by an alien invasion. 3 days ago, Governor Walsh began, "We received a transmission from the Vorthak Empire. Standard ultimatum: surrender unconditionally or face annihilation. They've given us 7 days to respond." "That's 4 days from now," Sarah observed. "Exactly. Our military analysts believe they'll arrive exactly on schedule if we refuse to surrender." The Vorthak are apparently very punctual when it comes to conquest. They pulled up to a modest building on the outskirts of the city, its architecture designed to blend with the surrounding forest. Sarah noted the discreet security measures, hidden sensors, reinforced construction, emergency exits that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. "This is our Xenobiology Research Center," Walsh explained as they entered the facility. "We've converted it into a command center for studying the threat. Dr. Marcus Vega is our head researcher here. He'll be your primary liaison." Dr. Vega turned out to be an enthusiastic man in his early 40s, with the kind of intense energy that Sarah recognized in fellow scientists who had found their life's passion. His laboratory was immaculate, filled with sophisticated equipment for genetic analysis, behavioral studies, and biological modeling. "Dr. Chun, your reputation precedes you. The work you did with Earth's megafauna adaptation programs was groundbreaking." He gestured enthusiastically toward several large displays showing anatomical diagrams. "We've managed to compile some preliminary data on the Vorthak apex predators based on sensor readings and survivor testimonies." Sarah studied the displays with professional interest. The creatures were indeed imposing, humanoid but clearly non-human, with elongated limbs that suggested both strength and speed. What caught her attention, however, were the behavioral patterns described in the survivor accounts. "They seem to rely heavily on intimidation," she noted. "Most of the actual damage is psychological rather than physical." "That's our assessment as well," Vega agreed. "They're certainly capable of massive destruction, but they seem to prefer demonstrating their power rather than using it extensively. Most worlds surrender after seeing what just one of these creatures can do, which suggests they might not be quite as invulnerable as they want us to believe," Sarah mused. "May I see your biocontainment facilities?" Vega led her through several secure corridors to a section of the building that had been specifically designed for dangerous specimens. The containment units were state-of-the-art, with multiple redundant safety systems and environmental controls that could simulate conditions from hundreds of different worlds. "We have 12 units available, each capable of housing specimens up to 10 meters in length," Vega explained. "Though I'm not sure what we could study if we don't have access to an actual apex predator." Sarah smiled, thinking of the biocontainer that was currently being transferred from the transport ship. "Let me ask you something, Dr. Vega. What do you know about honey badgers?" He looked puzzled. "The Earth species? Not much, I'm afraid. Small carnivores, aren't they?" "Small, yes. But they have some very interesting characteristics that might be relevant to our situation." She pulled out her personal tablet and called up a video file. "This footage was taken at the conservation facility where my grandfather worked. That's Badger, named rather unimaginatively, I admit, confronting a lion that had wandered into the facility." Vega watched in amazement as the small, stocky creature fearlessly approached an animal more than 10 times its size. The lion, despite its overwhelming physical advantages, backed down and eventually retreated. "How was that possible?" Vega asked. "Honey badgers are perhaps the most fearless animals on Earth. They're also incredibly intelligent, adaptable, and absolutely refuse to be intimidated by size or strength. They've been known to drive away leopards, hyenas, and even entire packs of wild dogs. Sarah paused the video. But more importantly, they're social animals when properly introduced to other species. They can form bonds and work cooperatively. I'm not sure I follow the relevance to our current situation. Think about it from a different perspective. The Vorthack strategy relies entirely on their apex predators being perceived as unstoppable. But what if we could demonstrate otherwise? What if we could show that these supposedly invincible creatures can be challenged, even defeated, by something much smaller? Governor Walsh, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward with interest. Are you suggesting we try to capture one of these apex predators? I'm suggesting something potentially much more effective, Sarah replied. I'm proposing we introduce them to a creature that simply doesn't understand the concept of backing down. Over the next several hours, Sarah worked with Vega and his team to prepare for what she privately thought of as the most important scientific experiment of her career. The bio-container from the transport ship contained honey, especially trained honey badger who had been bred and raised in the conservation program that Sarah's grandfather had helped develop. Unlike her wild cousins, Honey had been socialized from birth to work with humans and other species. She was intelligent, fearless, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to assess and exploit the weaknesses of larger predators. Most importantly, she had been trained in what Sarah's grandfather had called applied fearlessness, the art of using an opponent's expectations against them. As the sun set over New Adelaide, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Sarah stood in the research facility's main laboratory with Honey's containment unit nearby. The honey badger was awake and alert, her dark eyes intelligent and curious as she observed her new surroundings. The Vorthack will be here in 3 days, Governor Walsh said quietly. Do you really think this will work? Sarah looked at the photo of her grandfather and Badger, remembering his words about understanding being the key to both friendship and victory. My grandfather used to say that every predator has a weakness. Usually, their weakness is their confidence. They expect their prey to be afraid, to run, to submit. When that doesn't happen, they don't know how to respond. And you think a 30-pound honey badger can exploit that weakness in an 8-foot alien killing machine? Sarah smiled, watching as Honey explored her temporary enclosure with the systematic thoroughness that made her species so remarkably successful. I think a 30-pound honey badger who has never learned to be afraid might teach a supposedly invincible predator something very important about the nature of fear. She turned to address the assembled team of researchers and military personnel who had gathered to observe the preparations. Ladies and gentlemen, in 72 hours, the Vorthack Empire will arrive expecting to demonstrate their power with creatures they believe are unstoppable. We're going to show them that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who simply refuses to be impressed. As if sensing the significance of the moment, Honey looked up from her exploration and made the distinctive chittering sound that honey badgers used when they were preparing for something interesting. To Sarah's trained ear, it sounded almost like laughter. The next 3 days would determine whether human curiosity and one small Earth predator could stand against the might of an interstellar empire. But as Sarah watched Honey settle down for the night, she felt a familiar confidence building in her chest. Her grandfather had always said that the best way to deal with a bully was to refuse to be bullied. Soon, the Vorthack would learn that humans had spent thousands of years living alongside creatures that simply didn't understand the meaning of surrender. And they were about to meet one of the finest examples of that philosophy that Earth had ever produced. Outside the research facility, the lights of Port Darwin twinkled like earthbound stars, while overhead, the real stars held their positions in patterns that had guided human navigation for millennia. Tomorrow, those same stars would witness something unprecedented in the galaxy's recorded history. A meeting between the Vorthack Empire's ultimate weapon and a species that had never learned to back down from a fight. Sarah Chun fell asleep that night with her grandfather's photo in her hand and the sound of Honey's quiet breathing nearby, knowing that everything they had worked for was about to be put to the ultimate test. The galaxy was about to discover that humans didn't just survive alongside Earth's most fearless creatures. They learned from them. The Vorthak vessels appeared in New Adelaide's orbital space exactly 72 hours after their ultimatum expired, their arrival heralded by the distinctive energy signatures that had become the calling card of conquest across 17 star systems. From a research facility's observation deck, Sarah watched through high-powered telescopes as 3 massive ships took position above the planet, sleek, predatory designs that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Right on schedule," Governor Walsh muttered, her knuckles white where she gripped the railing. "You have to admire their punctuality, even if everything else about them is terrifying." Dr. Vega was monitoring the communication arrays, his face pale but determined. "They're broadcasting on standard diplomatic frequencies. Same message they've used everywhere else. Final demand for unconditional surrender, followed by a demonstration of their power." Sarah nodded, her attention split between the alien ships and the small figure of Honey, who was exploring her expanded enclosure with typical honey badger thoroughness. Over the past 3 days, Sarah had worked intensively with the research team to understand everything they could about Vorthak tactics and psychology. The pattern was always the same: arrive, demand surrender, release an apex predator to demonstrate overwhelming force, then wait for capitulation. "How long before they deploy their creature?" she asked. "Based on previous conquests, approximately 30 minutes after their final warning," Walsh replied. "They like to give their ultimatums time to sink in." "And our military response?" "We've evacuated all civilians from the projected landing zone, just outside the city. Our defense forces are in position, but honestly, Dr. Chun, after seeing the footage from other worlds..." Walsh trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Sarah understood. The Vorthak apex predators had shrugged off plasma cannon fire, walked through explosive minefields without slowing down, and torn apart armored vehicles with their bare claws. Conventional military tactics had proven utterly ineffective against them. But conventional military tactics had never included a honey badger. "Dr. Vega, is the mobile containment unit ready?" Sarah asked. "Fully prepared. Honey's transport can be deployed to the landing zone within minutes of the apex predator's arrival." "Are you certain about this approach?" "We still have time to evacuate the research team to a safer distance." Sarah looked at the photograph of her grandfather and Badger, remembering the stories he had told about the early days of the conservation program. Back then, many experts had insisted that honey badgers were too aggressive and unpredictable to work with humans effectively. They had been wrong then, just as the Vorthak were wrong now about what constituted true strength. "My grandfather spent his entire career proving that understanding between species was possible," she said quietly. "He always believed that the key to dealing with any creature was to approach them with respect rather than fear. Today, we're going to test whether that principle works in both directions." The communication array crackled to life, and a voice that sounded like grinding metal filtered through the translation software. "People of New Adelaide, you have refused our generous offer of peaceful incorporation into the Vorthak Empire. We will now demonstrate the consequences of defying our will. Observe the power of the apex, and consider your remaining time carefully." Through the telescopes, Sarah could see a launch bay opening on the lead Vorthak vessel. Something large and dark emerged, falling toward the planet's surface with controlled precision. The object was roughly oval-shaped, perhaps 20 meters long, and it pulsed with an organic luminescence that was distinctly unsettling. "It's some kind of drop pod," Vega observed. "Biomechanical construction, probably designed to protect the creature during atmospheric entry." "Landing zone is confirmed," Walsh reported. "Same location as projected. The cleared field approximately 5 kilometers outside Port Darwin. All military units are standing by." Sarah moved to the console that controlled Honey's mobile containment unit. The honey badger was alert and curious, her head tilted as if she could sense the approaching excitement. Sarah had worked with honey badgers for most of her career, and she had never seen one that seemed so perfectly suited for this kind of encounter. Honey possessed the species' typical fearlessness, but also an unusual degree of intelligence and adaptability. Dr. Chun, Governor Walsh said urgently, "The pod has landed. Thermal readings show it's beginning to open." Sarah activated the transport system. Honey's mobile unit is deploying now. Dr. Vega, I need you to monitor all biological readings from both creatures. This is going to be unprecedented in every possible way. The mobile containment unit was essentially a sophisticated vehicle designed to keep Honey safe while allowing her maximum freedom to interact with her environment. It was armored against most forms of attack, climate-controlled, and equipped with sensors that would relay detailed information about everything Honey encountered. As the unit approached the landing zone, Sarah watched through its external cameras as the Vorthack drop pod completed its opening sequence. What emerged was indeed an impressive sight. The apex predator stood nearly 8 feet tall, with a lean, muscular build that suggested both power and speed. Its skin appeared to be some kind of biometallic composite, shifting between deep purple and silver as it moved. For arms ending in curved talons, a serpentine head with multiple eyes, and a presence that seemed to radiate menace even through the camera feed. "Dear God," Vega whispered, "look at those readings. The creature's generating some kind of electromagnetic field that interferes with electronic systems. That's probably why conventional weapons are so ineffective against it." The apex predator surveyed its surroundings with obvious confidence, its multiple eyes scanning the horizon with predatory patience. It moved with the flowing grace of something that had never encountered meaningful resistance, never doubted its own supremacy. Sarah opened the communication channel to Honey's unit. "Okay, girl, time to meet your new friend." Honey's mobile unit approached the landing zone from the opposite side, moving slowly and deliberately. Sarah had programmed it to stop approximately 50 meters from the apex predator, close enough for meaningful interaction, but far enough to allow for retreat if necessary. Through the cameras, she could see the moment when the apex predator first noticed the approaching vehicle. Its multiple eyes focused on the small unit, and its head tilted in what almost looked like confusion. This was clearly not the response it was accustomed to receiving. "Releasing Honey now," Sarah announced, activating the containment unit's exit sequence. What happened next would be debated by xenobiologists for decades to come. As Honey emerged from her transport, the apex predator took a step backward. Not in fear, Sarah realized, but in genuine surprise. The creature had obviously expected screaming humans, fleeing civilians, or attacking soldiers. It had not expected a 30-pound honey badger to walk calmly out of a small vehicle and begin examining its surroundings with scientific curiosity. Honey exhibited the behavior that had made her species legendary among Earth's wildlife researchers. She approached the situation with complete confidence, showing no sign of intimidation despite the massive size difference. Her movements were purposeful and intelligent, suggesting a creature that was evaluating this new encounter according to her own criteria rather than responding to the apex predator's implied threat. "The electromagnetic readings are fluctuating," Vega reported, his voice tight with excitement. "The apex predator's energy field is becoming unstable. I think it's confused by Honey's lack of fear response." On the screen, Sarah could see the alien creature attempting to establish dominance through the techniques that had worked on 17 other worlds. It expanded its 4 arms to their full span, making itself appear larger and more threatening. It emitted a sound that the audio pickups registered as somewhere between a roar and a mechanical scream. Its biometallic skin shifted to deeper, more aggressive colors. Honey's response was to sit down and begin grooming herself, completely ignoring the display of intimidation. "That's remarkable," Sarah murmured. "She's treating it exactly like she would treat any large predator back on Earth, with polite indifference until it proves itself worthy of attention." The apex predator tried a different approach, moving closer to Honey with obvious predatory intent. But here, thousands of years of evolution kicked in. Honey badgers had survived on a planet full of creatures much larger and potentially more dangerous than themselves by developing an almost supernatural ability to read predatory behavior and respond appropriately. As the apex predator approached, Honey stood up and made a series of chittering sounds that any honey badger researcher would recognize immediately. She was establishing territorial boundaries and indicating that while she had no intention of starting a fight, she was perfectly prepared to finish one if necessary. The alien creature has stopped moving, Vega observed. Its electromagnetic field is continuing to fluctuate, but it seems unable to decide how to respond to Honey's behavior. Sarah smiled, remembering her grandfather's stories about similar encounters between badger and much larger predators. It's never dealt with a creature that refuses to be impressed by size and power. Honey isn't afraid because she doesn't understand why she should be afraid. From her perspective, this is just another large animal that needs to learn some manners. What happened next exceeded even Sarah's optimistic expectations. After several minutes of apparent confusion, the apex predator began to exhibit behaviors that were clearly not part of its standard intimidation routine. It moved more slowly, its posture becoming less aggressive. When Honey approached to within about 10 meters, the creature actually sat down, mirroring her position. "Are they communicating?" Walsh asked in amazement. "It looks like it," Sarah replied. Honey's showing the same behaviors she uses with new animals at the conservation facility. Cautious interest combined with absolute confidence in her own safety. The apex predator seems to be responding to that confidence. Dr. Vega was frantically recording everything as the two creatures began what could only be described as a conversation. They used body language, vocalizations, and positioning to convey information that transcended species barriers. Honey approached closer, and the apex predator allowed it. When Honey sat down again, the alien creature lowered itself to a less threatening height. "The electromagnetic readings have stabilized," Vega reported. "Whatever field the creature generates, it seems to be calming down as its stress levels decrease." For nearly an hour, the two creatures continued their unprecedented interaction. Honey maintained her typical honey badger behavior. Curious but unafraid, confident but not aggressive. The apex predator gradually abandoned its intimidation displays entirely, instead seeming to study this small earth mammal that simply refused to be terrorized. "Dr. Chin," Governor Walsh said suddenly, "we're receiving a communication from the Vorthack ships." Sarah reluctantly tore her attention away from the remarkable scene on the screen. "What are they saying?" "They want to know why their apex predator is not demonstrating its power as expected." They seemed confused. Sarah keyed the communication system. "Patch me through to their command vessel." The metallic voice of the Vorthack commander filled the research facility. "Humans of New Adelaide, explain the malfunction of your technology that prevents our apex from completing its demonstration." "There's no malfunction," Sarah replied calmly. "Your apex predator has simply met a creature that doesn't understand fear the way you expect it to. Our representative is conducting a peaceful first contact protocol." There was a long pause before the Vorthack commander responded. "Peaceful contact is not possible with an apex predator. They're weapons of war, designed only for domination and destruction." "Perhaps," Sarah said, watching as Honey and the apex predator continue their strange conversation, "you've never given them the opportunity to be anything else." On the screen, something unprecedented was happening. The apex predator had lowered its head to Honey's level, and the honey badger was actually touching one of its taloned hands with her paw, the same gesture she used with humans and other animals to establish trust and friendship. Sarah's grandfather had always said that understanding between species was possible if both sides approached the encounter with respect rather than fear. Today, a honey badger from Earth and an alien bioweapon were proving him right in the most spectacular way imaginable. But as Sarah watched the remarkable interaction continue, she knew that this was only the beginning. The Vorthack Empire had built their conquest strategy around the assumption that fear was universal. that all creatures would eventually submit to superior force. Honey was demonstrating that some creatures simply didn't operate according to those assumptions. The question now was whether the Vorthack would learn from this lesson, or whether their response would escalate the situation to an even more dangerous level. Either way, Sarah realized the galaxy had just witnessed something that would change the balance of power forever. A 30-pound honey badger had just made friends with the most feared weapon in known space. And that, Sarah thought with growing excitement, was only the beginning of what humans and their Earth companions might accomplish together. The Vorthack response came 8 hours after their apex predator had settled down for what appeared to be a peaceful nap alongside Honey. Sarah had spent those hours in the research facility's main laboratory, analyzing the biological data that Dr. Vega's sensors had collected during the unprecedented encounter. What she discovered would change everything they thought they knew about the Vorthack Empire's ultimate weapons. The electromagnetic field signatures are fascinating, Vega said, pointing to a complex pattern on his display screen. When the apex predator first arrived, it was generating massive amounts of electromagnetic interference, enough to disable most electronic systems within a 100-meter radius. But look at this. He highlighted a section of the timeline that corresponded to Honey's initial approach. The field strength begins decreasing almost immediately when Honey shows no fear response. By the time they're sitting together, the electromagnetic output has dropped to less than 10% of its initial level. Sarah studied the data with growing understanding. It's not a weapon system at all. It's a stress response. Exactly what I was thinking. The electromagnetic field appears to be generated involuntarily when the creature is in a state of heightened aggression or anxiety. The more calm and relaxed it becomes, the weaker the field, which explains why conventional weapons are so ineffective against these creatures, Sarah realized. It's not that they're invulnerable. It's that the act of attacking them with technological weapons triggers their defensive systems. Dr. Vega nodded enthusiastically, but Honey approached without any electronic systems, showing no aggressive intent and demonstrating no fear. The apex predator had no reason to maintain its defensive field. Governor Walsh entered the laboratory looking haggard but determined. She had spent the night coordinating with military commanders and civilian authorities, trying to prepare for whatever the Vorthack might do next. Dr. Chun, we've received another transmission from the alien fleet. They want to retrieve their apex predator and conduct what they call a proper demonstration. I take it you decline? I told them we would consider their request after our diplomatic first contact protocols were completed. That bought us some time, but probably not much. Walsh moved to the observation window that looked out toward the landing zone. Through high-powered scopes, they could see Honey and the apex predator still resting together in the morning sunlight. Is there any chance that creature might actually be peaceful by nature? Sarah considered the question carefully. Everything they had observed suggested that the apex predators were indeed engineered for combat, but their behavior patterns indicated something far more complex than simple killing machines. Dr. Vega, can you bring up the biological analysis from yesterday's interaction? The screens filled with detailed readings of both creatures' vital signs, hormone levels, and neurological activity. Sarah had spent years learning to interpret similar data from Earth species, and the patterns were remarkably familiar. Look at this, she said, highlighting specific sections of the data. The apex predator shows elevated stress hormones and aggressive neural patterns when it first emerges from the drop pod. But as the interaction with Honey progresses, you can see cortisol levels dropping and different brain regions becoming active. What does that suggest? Walsh asked. It suggests that these creatures are capable of much more complex emotional and social responses than the Vorthack realize. The aggression and intimidation behaviors are learned or programmed responses, but underneath that conditioning, they're social beings. Dr. Vega pulled up additional data screens. I've been comparing the apex predator's biological readings to our xenological databases. There are some striking similarities to pack-hunting species from several different worlds, creatures that are fierce in combat, but also capable of forming complex social bonds. Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle falling into place. What if the Vorthack aren't just using these creatures as weapons? What if they're systematically suppressing their natural social instincts to make them more effective in combat? The implications were staggering. If the apex predators were naturally social creatures that had been conditioned or modified to be solitary weapons, then Honey's approach might have awakened instincts that had been dormant for years. "We need to test this theory," Sarah said. "Dr. Vega, is it possible to get more detailed neurological readings from our friend out there? I can deploy additional sensors, but we need to get them much closer." The apex predator would have to cooperate. "Leave that to Honey. She's developed a remarkable rapport with our visitor." Over the next several hours, Sarah supervised the deployment of sophisticated monitoring equipment around the landing zone. The process required delicate coordination with Honey, who had been trained to assist with scientific observations in much the same way that working dogs assisted with search and rescue operations. What they discovered exceeded even Sarah's optimistic projections. The apex predator not only tolerated the monitoring equipment, but actively helped position it for optimal readings. More importantly, detailed brain scans revealed neural activity patterns that were consistent with highly intelligent, socially complex creatures. These readings suggest cognitive abilities comparable to Earth's higher primates, Vega reported. Problem-solving skills, emotional processing, even what appears to be abstract reasoning. This creature is far more than a biological weapon. Sarah was studying the social interaction patterns when an idea began forming in her mind. "Dr. Vega, in your database research, did you find any information about how the Vorthack acquire their apex predators?" "Limited information, but what we have suggests they're bred or created in specialized facilities. No one has ever reported seeing young apex predators or family groups." "Because they're taken from their families when they're young," Sarah said grimly. "Just like any other creature that's been turned into a weapon through conditioning and isolation." The communication array activated suddenly, and the harsh voice of the Vorthack commander filled the laboratory. "Humans of New Adelaide, you will return our apex immediately. Further delay will result in the deployment of additional units." Sarah exchanged glances with Governor Walsh, then keyed the response system. "Commander, we're prepared to discuss the return of your representative, but we have some concerns about its welfare that we'd like to address first." The welfare of an apex is not a concern for inferior species. They exist to serve the Empire's expansion. But this particular individual seems to have formed a bond with our representative. Separating them now might cause psychological trauma. There was a long pause, during which Sarah could almost hear the Vorthack commander trying to process the concept of an apex predator forming emotional attachments. Apex units do not form bonds. They are weapons. Return it immediately or face the consequences. Sarah looked out at the landing zone, where Honey and the apex predator were engaged in what appeared to be a game of some kind. The alien creature would move its taloned hands in complex patterns, and Honey would respond with corresponding movements, both creatures clearly enjoying the interaction. "Commander," Sarah said carefully, "what if I told you that your apex predator might be happier and more effective if it were allowed to maintain social connections?" Happiness is irrelevant. Effectiveness is achieved through isolation and conditioning. But what if you're wrong? What if the social isolation is actually limiting their potential? Another long pause, and when the Vorthack commander spoke again, his tone carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Explain your meaning." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words might determine the fate of not just New Adelaide, but potentially the entire Vorthack Empire's approach to conquest. On Earth, we've learned that even our most effective working animals, dogs, horses, dolphins, perform better when they have social bonds and emotional support. Isolation and fear-based conditioning might produce obedient weapons, but it doesn't produce truly optimal performance. You suggest that our apex units could be made more effective through social interaction? "I'm suggesting that your apex predators might be far more capable than you realize, if they were allowed to develop their full potential instead of being limited by artificial constraints. Dr. Vega was frantically taking notes, recognizing the historical significance of this conversation. Governor Walsh looked pale but determined, understanding that they were potentially negotiating not just for their own world, but for a fundamental change in how an entire galactic empire approached the relationship between intelligence and power. "This conversation interests us," the Vorthack commander said finally. "We will deploy additional units for comparison purposes. If your theory proves correct, the Empire may consider adjustments to our protocols." Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized what she had just agreed to. "How many additional units?" "3. They will arrive within one planetary rotation. You will demonstrate your social bonding technique with all 4 Apex units simultaneously." The communication ended abruptly, leaving Sarah, Walsh, and Vega staring at each other in stunned silence. 3 more Apex Predators," Walsh said weakly. "Dr. Chun, please tell me you have a plan for dealing with 3 more of these creatures." Sarah looked at the photo of her grandfather and Badger, then out at the landing zone where Honey continued to play with her new friend. "Actually, Governor, I think we're going to need more honey badgers." Over the next 18 hours, Sarah worked with colonial authorities to arrange emergency transport for 3 additional honey badgers from Earth's conservation programs. Each badger had been selected for specific traits: intelligence, adaptability, and exceptional social skills. More importantly, each had been trained in the same protocols that had made Honey so successful in interspecies communication. As the second day drew to a close, Sarah stood on the observation deck watching the alien ships maneuver in orbit. Tomorrow, the Vorthack would deploy 3 additional Apex Predators, expecting either a demonstration of improved effectiveness through social bonding or a spectacular failure that would justify their existing methods. But Sarah had learned something important from Honey's interaction with the first Apex Predator. These creatures weren't just weapons that had been deprived of social contact. They were individuals with personalities, preferences, and emotional needs that had been systematically ignored by their creators. The Vorthack Empire had built their conquest strategy around the assumption that the most effective weapons were those that had been stripped of everything except the capacity for violence. Tomorrow, 4 honey badgers from Earth would demonstrate that the most effective partnerships were built on mutual respect, understanding, and the kind of fearless friendship that could bridge any gap. Even the gulf between species is separated by thousands of light years. As Sarah prepared for sleep, she realized that they were no longer just defending New Adelaide from conquest. They were potentially liberating an entire species from a conditioning system that had robbed them of their true nature. Her grandfather had always said that the best way to understand a creature was to give it the opportunity to show you who it really was, rather than who it had been forced to become. Tomorrow, the galaxy would discover what Apex Predators were truly capable of when they were allowed to be themselves. And Sarah suspected that the Vorthack Empire was about to learn that their greatest weapons had always been their greatest victims. The second wave of Vorthack drop pods descended through New Adelaide's atmosphere like falling stars, their biomechanical surfaces glowing with the same ominous phosphorescence that had marked their predecessor's arrival. Sarah watched from the Research Facilities Command Center as 3 additional pods touched down in the expanded containment area that had been hastily prepared overnight. Transport ships from Earth arrived 4 hours ago, Dr. Vega reported, his voice tight with exhaustion and anticipation. Badger, Scout, and Thunder are all acclimated and ready for deployment. Their handlers confirm that all 3 show optimal behavioral patterns for this type of first contact scenario. Sarah nodded, her attention split between the incoming data streams and the remarkable scene playing out in the original landing zone. Honey and the first Apex Predator, whom the research team had begun calling Alpha, were engaged in what could only be described as collaborative problem-solving. They had constructed an elaborate arrangement of stones and debris that served no apparent function except to demonstrate their ability to work together on complex tasks. The new pods are opening, Governor Walsh announced from her position at the tactical display. 3 more apex predators, just as promised. Through the high-resolution cameras, Sarah could see the emergence of the additional creatures. Each was physically similar to Alpha, but with distinct variations in size, coloration, and what appeared to be specialized adaptations. One was notably larger and more heavily built, another showed more agile proportions, and the third displayed what looked like enhanced sensory organs. They're not identical units, Sarah observed. These are individuals with different specializations, which supports your theory about them being naturally social creatures, Vega added. Specialized roles within a group structure is a classic indicator of pack intelligence. The 3 new apex predators had emerged from their pods and were now surveying their surroundings with the same predatory confidence that Alpha had initially displayed. But there was something different in their behavior. They seemed to be looking for something specific. They're searching for Alpha, Sarah realized. Look at their body language. They're trying to locate their missing pack member. Indeed, the 3 creatures had begun making sounds that the audio equipment registered as complex vocalizations. Not the aggressive roars they had expected, but what sounded like long-distance communication calls. Alpha's responding, Vega said excitedly, pointing to the readings from the original landing zone. Its electromagnetic signature just spiked briefly, probably some kind of recognition signal. Sarah activated the communication system for all 4 Honey Badger deployment units. All right, everyone, this is what we've been preparing for. Badger, Scout, Thunder, you know your roles. Honey has already established the protocol with Alpha, so follow her lead and remember everything we practiced. The 4 mobile containment units moved toward their respective targets with coordinated precision. Sarah had spent the night working with the Honey Badger handlers to develop an approach that would allow all 4 Earth mammals to establish contact simultaneously while providing mutual support if any of the interactions went poorly. What happened next would be studied by xenosociologists for generations to come. As Badger's unit approached the largest of the new apex predators, the creature immediately focused on the small vehicle with obvious interest rather than hostility. Unlike Alpha's initial confusion, this individual seemed to recognize that something unprecedented was happening. The creature's electromagnetic readings are much lower than expected, Vega reported. It's not generating nearly as much defensive field energy as Alpha did initially. Because it can sense Alpha's calm state from here, Sarah said. Pheromones, electromagnetic signals, maybe even sound frequencies below our hearing range. The pack is already communicating. Badger emerged from his unit with the same fearless confidence that had made Honey's approach so successful. But this time, the apex predator was prepared for the encounter. Instead of attempting intimidation displays, it simply sat down and waited to see what this small Earth creature would do. Similar scenes were playing out across the containment area as Scout and Thunder made contact with their assigned apex predators. Each interaction was unique, reflecting both the individual personalities of the Honey Badgers and the specialized nature of their alien counterparts. Scout, whose name reflected his exceptional curiosity and problem-solving abilities, approached the most agile of the apex predators. The alien creature seemed fascinated by Scout's systematic exploration of the environment, and within minutes, both were engaged in what appeared to be a mutual investigation of interesting objects in their vicinity. Thunder, the largest and most confident of the Honey Badgers, paired with the apex predator that showed enhanced sensory adaptations. Their interaction quickly evolved into a complex communication exercise, with Thunder testing different sounds and movements to see how his partner would respond. But the most remarkable development came when Alpha, apparently sensing the successful contact between his pack mates and the humans' representatives, began moving toward the other landing zones. Alpha's leaving Honey, Walsh observed with concern. Is that normal behavior? Actually, it's exactly what we hoped would happen, Sarah replied, watching the readings with growing excitement. Alpha is acting as a pack leader, checking on his group members and facilitating their integration with the new social contacts. What followed was unlike anything in recorded xenological history. The four apex predators gradually moved closer together, bringing their honey badger partners with them, until all 8 creatures were interacting in a complex social group that transcended species boundaries. The electromagnetic readings are fascinating, Vega reported, his voice filled with scientific wonder. All 4 apex predators are generating synchronized field pulses, like they're establishing a group communication network. Sarah could see the pattern forming before her eyes. The apex predators were demonstrating natural behaviors that had probably been suppressed for their entire lives. They were pack animals designed by evolution or engineering to work together cooperatively. The Vorthack conditioning had forced them into isolation, making them less effective rather than more. Dr. Chun, the communication system crackled with the voice of the Vorthack commander, explained the readings our sensors are detecting. The Apex units are exhibiting unprecedented behavioral patterns. They're doing what comes naturally, Sarah replied. Commander, how long has it been since your Apex predators were allowed to interact with others of their kind? Interaction between units is prohibited. It interferes with their conditioning and reduces their effectiveness. Commander, I think you need to see what we're seeing down here. Sarah activated the video transmission system, sending real-time footage of the interaction zone to the Vorthack ships. The alien commander would be watching 4 of his most feared weapons playing, cooperating, and clearly enjoying themselves in the company of creatures that should have been terrified of them. The honey badgers had done more than establish peaceful contact. They had awakened social instincts that the Vorthack had spent years trying to suppress. The apex predators were demonstrating problem-solving abilities, cooperative behaviors, and what could only be described as joy in their interactions with both their own kind and their new Earth friends. This is impossible, the Vorthack commander said, but his tone carried uncertainty rather than conviction. Apex units do not exhibit these behaviors under standard protocols. Because your standard protocols don't allow for social interaction, Sarah explained. Commander, these creatures are showing you their true potential. They're not just weapons. They're individuals capable of forming bonds, working cooperatively, and thinking creatively. On the screen, Alpha was demonstrating a particularly complex behavior sequence, using rocks and debris to construct what appeared to be a shelter. The other 3 apex predators were contributing to the project, each using their specialized abilities to enhance the construction. Meanwhile, the 4 honey badgers were providing supervision, critique, and what looked suspiciously like encouragement. The complexity of this cooperative behavior is remarkable, Vega observed. They're not just working together, they're teaching each other new techniques and sharing resources. Dr. Chun, Governor Walsh, said quietly, "We're receiving additional communications from the Vorthack fleet. They want to land a shuttle and observe the interaction directly." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment she had been working toward since the beginning. Direct contact between humans and Vorthack, mediated by the success of the interspecies cooperation they had achieved. Tell them they're welcome to land, but they come as observers and guests, not conquerors. They follow our protocols for peaceful interaction. The next hour saw unprecedented activity as a Vorthack shuttle descended to land near the research facility. Sarah, accompanied by Dr. Vega and a small team of researchers, met the alien delegation at what had hastily been designated as a formal first contact site. The Vorthack were surprisingly humanoid in appearance, though taller and more angular than humans. Their leader, who identified himself as Commander Thex, moved with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to absolute authority. But his large, multifaceted eyes showed something that Sarah recognized immediately: genuine curiosity. Dr. Chun, Commander Thex said, his translated voice carrying less of the metallic harshness that had characterized their communications. "You have achieved something that our scientists insisted was impossible. Our Apex units are displaying behaviors that contradict fundamental assumptions about their nature." "Commander," Sarah replied, I think your scientists may have been operating under some false assumptions about what makes an effective warrior. They walked together toward the interaction zone, where the remarkable cooperative group was still engaged in their construction project. As they approached, Alpha looked up and made a series of vocalizations that the other apex predators immediately responded to. They recognize you, Sarah observed. They know you're connected to their conditioning. Commander Thex stopped walking, his expression unreadable. In our culture, we believe that individual strength could only be achieved through elimination of weakness. Social bonds, emotional attachments, cooperative behaviors. These were seen as vulnerabilities that reduced combat effectiveness. But what if you were wrong? Sarah asked gently. What if social bonds actually make them stronger? They watched as the 4 apex predators completed their construction project, a complex shelter that incorporated the specialized abilities of each individual while providing protection and comfort for all 4 honey badgers. It was a masterpiece of cooperative engineering that no single creature could have achieved alone. Commander, Dr. Vega said, our biological readings suggest that these creatures are operating at cognitive levels far above what your records indicate. The social interaction appears to be unlocking mental capabilities that were suppressed by isolation. Commander Thex observed the scene for several minutes in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. If this is true, then the Empire has committed a grave error. We have taken our greatest treasures and turned them into shadows of their true selves. Sarah felt a moment of profound hope as she watched the Vorthack commander beginning to understand what they had accomplished. But she also knew that this was only the beginning. Changing an entire empire's approach to power and conquest would require more than one successful demonstration. Commander, she said, there's something else we need to discuss. If these creatures are naturally social, then separating them now would be cruel to all involved. The honey badgers have formed bonds with your people, and your people have clearly found something they've been missing. On cue, Honey approached the group, leading Alpha behind her. The massive apex predator moved with careful precision, stopping just close enough to demonstrate peaceful intent without appearing threatening. But what happened next surprised everyone. Alpha extended one of his taloned hands toward Commander Thex in what was unmistakably an offer of greeting. The moment stretched out as the Vorthack commander faced a choice that would determine not just the fate of New Adelaide, but the future of his entire species' approach to power and conquest. Sarah held her breath, knowing that everything they had worked for hung in the balance of this single interaction. Commander Thex stood motionless for nearly 30 seconds, staring at Alpha's extended hand while the weight of centuries of Vorthack military doctrine warred with the evidence of his own eyes. Sarah could see the conflict playing out in his angular features, the trained response to view any deviation from protocol as weakness battling against the undeniable proof that their most fundamental assumptions had been wrong. Finally, with movements that spoke of a decision that would reshape his entire worldview, Commander Thex reached out and carefully touched his own elongated fingers to Alpha's talon palm. The moment of contact seemed to send a ripple through the assembled group. The other 3 apex predators turned to watch, their electromagnetic fields synchronizing in patterns that Dr. Vega's instruments registered as complex harmonic frequencies. The honey badgers, with their uncanny ability to read social dynamics, moved closer to their respective partners in what Sarah recognized as a supportive formation. The connection is real, Commander Thex said, his translated voice carrying wonder and something that might have been pain. I can feel what it feels. The loneliness, the confusion, the desperate need for companionship that we trained out of them systematically. Alpha made a series of soft vocalizations, and Commander Thex responded with sounds that clearly came from deep in his throat rather than through the translation device. They were communicating in the apex predator's natural language, a capacity that suggested the Vorthack had once understood these creatures far better than their current military protocols indicated. How long has it been since your people communicated with them directly? Sarah asked. Generations. When we first developed the Apex program, there were those who advocated for maintaining the natural social bonds. But the military efficiency experts argued that emotional attachments reduced combat effectiveness. Commander Thex paused, his large eyes reflecting something that looked like regret. We chose efficiency over understanding. Dr. Vega was recording everything, recognizing that they were witnessing history in the making. Commander, if I may ask, what were the apex predators originally, before they were turned into weapons? They were our partners, Thex replied quietly. On our homeworld, the creatures you call apex predators were our companions, our co-workers, our friends. They helped us build our first cities, explore dangerous territories, and eventually reach the stars. But when we encountered other species that feared them, we began to see their intimidating appearance as a tool for conquest rather than cooperation. The implications were staggering. The Vorthak Empire had built their expansion strategy around corrupting their own oldest and most valued partnerships, turning their companions into weapons, and then wondering why they seemed less effective than expected. Commander, Governor Walsh said carefully, if this is true, then your empire has been conquered by its own weapons program. You've let military efficiency destroy the very relationships that made your species great. Commander Thex nodded slowly. I am beginning to understand that our expansion has been driven not by strength, but by a fundamental weakness, our inability to maintain the bonds that once made us whole. As if sensing the significance of this moment, Honey approached and sat down between Commander Thex and Alpha, looking up at both of them with the expectant expression that any honey badger researcher would recognize. She was waiting for them to figure out the next step in their relationship. She wants you to play, Sarah said with a smile. Honey believes that the best way to understand someone is to see how they interact when they're enjoying themselves. What followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of interspecies diplomacy. Commander Thex, guided by Alpha's patient demonstrations and Honey's enthusiastic encouragement, began to rediscover behaviors that his people had abandoned centuries ago. The other Vorthak crew members who had accompanied him gradually joined the interaction, each finding themselves drawn into the complex social dynamics that the apex predators were demonstrating. Dr. Chun, Dr. Vega said quietly, the electromagnetic readings are showing patterns I've never seen before. All four apex predators are generating coordinated fields that seem to be facilitating communication between different species. Sarah watched in fascination as humans, Vorthak, apex predators, and honey badgers all began to participate in what could only be described as a multilateral conversation. Each species contributed their own forms of communication, verbal language, electromagnetic signals, body language, and what appear to be shared emotional states. It's like they're translating for each other, Sarah realized. The apex predators are serving as communication bridges between species that have completely different sensory and cognitive systems. Commander Thex looked up from where he had been engaged in what appeared to be a collaborative puzzle-solving exercise with Alpha and Thunder. Dr. Chun, this capability was mentioned in our oldest records, but we dismissed it as primitive superstition. Our ancestors spoke of apex units that could facilitate understanding between different tribes and species. Maybe it wasn't superstition, Sarah suggested. Maybe your ancestors understood something about cooperation that your modern military forgot. Over the next several hours, the gathering evolved into something unprecedented, a genuine cultural exchange between species that had never expected to meet as equals. The Vorthak crew members shared stories about their homeworld, their original partnership with the apex predators, and their growing understanding of how far their empire had strayed from its founding principles. The humans reciprocated with their own stories about Earth, the conservation programs that had taught them to work with rather than dominate other species, and their philosophy of approaching unknown creatures with curiosity rather than fear. But it was the honey badgers who provided the most profound demonstration of interspecies cooperation. Working together with their apex predator partners, they began to construct something that none of the observers initially understood, a complex, three-dimensional structure that seemed to serve no practical purpose. It's art, Dr. Vegas said suddenly. They're making art together. Indeed, the structure was beautiful in its complexity, incorporating elements that reflected the aesthetic sensibilities of multiple species. It was neither human nor vorthack, nor honey badger nor apex predator. It was something entirely new, created through genuine collaboration between beings who had found a way to understand each other across vast differences in biology and culture. Commander, Sarah said, I think your apex predators are trying to show us something about what's possible when different species work together instead of trying to dominate each other. Commander Thex studied the emerging artwork with obvious amazement. Our military protocols forbid apex units from engaging in creative activities. We considered such behaviors a waste of their combat potential. But look what they're capable of when they're allowed to express themselves freely, Governor Walsh observed. This isn't the work of weapons. This is the work of artists and philosophers. As the day progressed, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between all the species present. The Vorthack crew members were rediscovering aspects of their own culture that had been suppressed by military doctrine. The humans were learning about approaches to interspecies cooperation that extended far beyond anything they had imagined. The apex predators were demonstrating capabilities that their conditioning had hidden for generations. And the honey badgers were doing what they did best, fearlessly facilitating friendship between creatures who had thought they were enemies. Dr. Chen, Commander Thex said as the sun began to set over New Adelaide, I must return to my ship and report to the Empire. But I cannot report this as a failed conquest. What would you call what has happened here? Sarah looked at the remarkable gathering, humans and aliens, predators and prey, former enemies who had become collaborators in the span of a single day. I think, Commander, you should report it as a successful first contact. The beginning of something entirely new. And the apex units? Sarah smiled, watching as Honey and Alpha settled down together for the night, joined by their companions in a peaceful multi-species gathering. I think they found something they've been looking for their entire lives. The question is whether the Vorthack Empire is ready to rediscover what it means to be partners rather than conquerors. Commander Thex was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. It will not be easy to convince the Empire to abandon conquest in favor of cooperation. There are many who benefit from the current system. But you have proof now that there's a better way, Sarah pointed out. And you have partners who can help you demonstrate that cooperation is more effective than domination. The apex units cannot return to the Empire as they are. They have been changed by this experience, and they would not accept the old conditioning. Then, maybe it's time for the Empire to change instead of trying to change them back. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries to come. Commander Thex made a decision that defied every protocol in the Vorthack military manual. Instead of retrieving the apex predators and returning to report a successful demonstration of force, he opened formal diplomatic communications with the human colonial government. The negotiations that followed established New Adelaide as the first joint human Vorthack research station dedicated to studying cooperative approaches to interspecies relations. The 4 apex predators became the founding members of an unprecedented ambassador program, working with their honey badger partners to facilitate communication between species that had previously seen each other only as threats or resources. Dr. Sarah Chun became the first human xenobiologist to be awarded honorary citizenship in the Vorthack Empire, though she chose to remain on New Adelaide, where her research could continue. Her grandfather's photograph remained in her pocket, but now was joined by dozens of new pictures showing honey badgers and apex predators working together on projects that neither species could have accomplished alone. The Vorthack Empire's expansion didn't stop, but its nature changed completely. Instead of conquest through force, they began offering partnership through cooperation. Species that had once fled at the approach of Vorthack ships now competed for the opportunity to join research projects and cultural exchanges. The honey badgers, for their part, became the galaxy's most celebrated diplomats. Their fearless approach to friendship and their refusal to be intimidated by size, power, or unfamiliar appearances made them perfect ambassadors between species that might otherwise never have found common ground. But perhaps the most significant change was in the apex predators themselves. Released from the isolation and conditioning that had turned them into weapons, they revealed themselves to be among the galaxy's most gifted artists, philosophers, and teachers. Their unique ability to facilitate communication between different species made them invaluable partners in the growing network of interstellar cooperation. Years later, Sarah would often stand on the observation deck of the New Adelaide Research Station, watching as ships from dozens of different worlds arrived to participate in the ongoing project of building understanding between species. The station had grown from a single research facility into a sprawling complex that housed thousands of beings from across the galaxy, all working together on the principle that cooperation was more powerful than conquest. In the habitat sections, honey badgers and apex predators could be seen teaching young beings from various species the principles of fearless friendship and mutual respect. The techniques they demonstrated had spread throughout the galaxy, transforming first contact protocols and making peaceful cooperation the standard rather than the exception. Sarah kept her grandfather's photograph on her desk, but now was surrounded by awards, commendations, and gifts from species across the galaxy, all thanking the humans and their small Earth companions for showing them that the most dangerous creature in the universe was not the largest or the strongest, but the one who simply refused to accept that understanding was impossible. The honey badgers had taught the galaxy that sometimes the best way to deal with a supposed monster was to offer it friendship and see what happened. More often than not, it turned out that the monster had just been lonely, waiting for someone brave enough to make the first move toward understanding. And in a universe that had spent millennia assuming that different meant dangerous, that was perhaps the most revolutionary discovery of all. That courage and curiosity, combined with an absolute refusal to back down from friendship, could transform enemies into allies and weapons into partners. The Vorthack had believed their beasts were unstoppable. They were right, but not in the way they had expected. What proved truly unstoppable was the simple power of a creature that didn't know how to give up on the possibility of friendship, even with the most fearsome beings in the galaxy. The honey badgers had won not through superior force or advanced technology, but through the oldest and most powerful weapon humanity had ever discovered, the unshakable belief that every creature, no matter how frightening it appeared, was worth trying to understand. And in the end, that belief had changed everything.